So let me switch hats now. If I moderated the previous two speakers as a historian by training, I will now moderate the keynote address as the VP International of Tel Aviv University, because the title of the keynote address is the Globalization of Science, and we are privileged to have Dr. Alan Leshner as the keynote speaker here today. In fact, Alan has accompanied us in this Dead Sea initiative from the very beginning, so thank you so much for being one of us from the very first. I guess that most of you do know Alan and his career, but still let me mention that he was Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and former Executive Publisher of the Science family of journals. He was Director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse at the NIH, National Institute of Health, and he also served as Deputy Director and Acting Director of the National Institute of Mental Health, and in several roles at the National Science Foundation. And I could go on, but he already gives me the sign that this is enough. So Alan, the floor is yours.
I've never had such a dramatic effect in my whole life. That was fabulous. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for hanging in. I appreciate it. I would have been crushed if nobody was here. What a fabulous morning. That really was great. I'm sort of embarrassed to be. I don't have such interesting stuff as what we just heard. But in any event, first of all, thank you, Mira, for organizing such a fabulous, diverse. I'm sort of a dilettante of science, so I like everything. And this has really been fantastic, so I've enjoyed it greatly. Okay, I'm coming with a relatively simple set of messages, but I'm going to use a lot of slides and talk very fast in order to make the point. But basically, I have a good news, bad news message about what's happening to the global world scientific enterprise. I've spent the last 15 or 20 years worrying about a relatively simple issue. So first of all, this is the context. Science and technology have never been more important or prominent in modern life. They're embedded in every major societal issue, and I would challenge you to find a societal issue in which science is not either a cause or a potential cure. That's a list. I collect lists. We're not going to go through it. Don't get nervous. But scan. Okay, that's everything that people worry about, everything that people are concerned about, everything as a science and technology component. And in fact, science and technology have been major fuel for economic growth and productivity. That's a statistic often used in the United States. 50% of U.S. economic growth since World War II has been due to science and technology, and probably even more. The consequence, the corollaries of the importance and sort of prominence of science is that in order for people to prosper in the modern world, all people, they need to have some fundamental understanding and comfort with science and technology. I'm sorry to say they don't have to know the details of things like pituitary adrenocortical function, which is my own scientific home, but they have to understand the nature of the scientific enterprise. What is science? What isn't? For nations to prosper in the modern world, they have learned that they have to have scientific capacity. And then, of course, for us in the scientific community, we have to have a positive relationship between science and the rest of society. The consequence of that is that more and more countries are investing in science and building their own national scientific enterprises, and their motivation is obvious. That is, they want to reap the benefits of science wherever it goes on. They want to direct science to their own local issues, And of course, they want to take advantage locally of it. So, point one, more countries are investing in science. That's proof. So I've been collecting these little maps from the National Science Board's science and engineering indicators for years. This is the latest one, and I think I'm the only one who can read it up close, so I can tell you whatever I want. But one of the most dramatic things is that little, not that one. Okay. So if you look here, you'll see that 37% of the world's support for science and technology is now coming from Eastern and Southeastern Asia. I can tell you that 10 years ago, all of it was coming from here and here. And so that proportion has shifted dramatically. This is just another way of showing it. This is in, purchasing power parity equalized, but if you look over time, since 1981, more and more countries are investing in science. That's a particularly interesting one, which is making the United States government crazy, which is that, in fact, China has increased its investments at a tremendous rate. There also are more scientists around the world than ever before. This is just percent, numbers of scientists. The red one is Europe, and look who's coming up at it. That's this is the United States, and that's who coming up from China. Again, alarming the country. Okay, so countries are investing, there are more scientists, and they're publishing in different ways. So this is just the proportion, and you can see that it's changing over time, that the US, that used to dominate along with Europe, the amount of publishing has decreased in the percentage, right, while other countries are coming up in the proportion. So that the point of that is that the distribution of scientific publishing around the world has changed a lot. And international collaboration is becoming the norm rather than an exception. When I was training in science, nobody collaborated across countries, but now it's the norm. And I can tell you that over 50% of the papers published in the journal Science, in fact, have authors from multiple countries. It takes lots of different forms, one-on-one collaborations, big international projects, and then, interestingly, these shareable resources that a single country can't afford to build, but multiple countries can build it, and therefore everybody will use it. This is a thing about international collaboration, and again, I'm really sorry. I didn't have now that I'm retired, I have to make all my own slides, so I can't actually make nifty things happen, like make them readable. But so the one on the left, so the darker bars are 2006, the lighter bars are 2016. You can see that the percentage of articles that come from multiple institutions are increasing over time. But if you look here, you'll see that it's happening actually very dramatically internationally, so that more and more over time international collaboration is happening. It's happening in basically all fields. I won't go through that in detail, but you can see that it's a phenomenon that's very dramatic. Don't look at that, it's getting boring. Okay, so the message, science is going on all over the world, and it's happening in a collaborative way, and that's good. Building national science capacity is a necessary but not sufficient mechanism to reap the benefits. You have to have ways to exploit it. You need the capacity to translate science and technology into products and services. In the United States, we've built a series of centers around the country in order to facilitate that. We have something funded by NIH, which are called Ctsas, Clinical and Translational Science Awards. Their sole function, and they were established nearly 15 years ago, but the sole function of them is to take basic science and translate it into clinical application, and SF has been doing it for many more years, and you have to have other policies to make it work. So where it starts to get tough is if you go back to my starting context, most of the major issues facing humanity, facing the global society, are global in character as well as having scientific components. Then if you say, well, we want to apply science in order to affect those global issues, the scientific enterprise has to be able to function in a truly global way. Right now, we've gotten better and better at doing international collaborations on a one-to-one basis or on small scale. But if you want to tackle something like global climate change, you have to, in fact, be able to have a scientific enterprise that can function globally. And I wouldn't have gone through all that if it wasn't, unfortunately, not possible. In order to do it, you have to have, for example, global standards that everybody adheres to, like scientific ethics. I once was invited to go to an unnamed university in China and talk to the department chairs about failure in science and how failure is a natural part of scientific progress, and that they needed to work with their faculties to understand that if you did a scientific experiment and it didn't work, it was okay. You didn't have to fix it in order to have made it work. Think about that. That happened within the last 10 years, and it's a cultural phenomenon. Well, if you don't trust your colleagues in another country, right, to be able to fail in the project, you're not going to collaborate, you're not going to have this thing. There's a concept called harmonizing science policies, things like embryonic stem cell research. Different countries have different policies about whether you can do it. The use of animal subjects. Europe has become very different about it than my own country, for example. One other is the issue of the developing scientific communities. So if, in fact, more and more countries are investing in science, my favorite example is Rwanda, that in fact has been the fastest growing African economy, and it's growing at such a fast rate because they decided to invest in their brains, basically. They're building the economy on the brains of the people. Well, they can only do that if, in fact, they can generate and exploit the scientific progress that they're trying to get. And for the global scientific community, it's very important to find a way to bring that emerging scientific community into this more coherent, harmonized one. Does that make sense, or am I talking to myself? Nod if it makes any sense. Thank you. A couple of you did. You made me feel better. Okay. So this issue has been an obsession of mine for years. I wrote an editorial in Science about it about 10 years ago. And to my delight, I have noticed that I'm not the only person obsessed with it. There are now more and more organizations that are worrying about this question of globalization. So there's an organization called HEROES. I like that. It's an acronym. Heads of research organizations love acronyms, and they come up with ones anyway. So these are the biomedical research supporters around the country have formed an organization called HEROES in order to try to build this coherence, in order to try to harmonize the policies surrounding science so that, in fact, they can collaborate in a global way and do it. There's another one called the Global Research Council that I was happily involved in the beginning, that now has over 70 countries, in fact, are represented, and they meet once a year and tackle difficult common issues like publication policy or human subjects or What are we going to do about the next generation of researchers? And then there's this new phenomenon called science diplomacy. And it's something that started, again, about 15 years ago. It's actually been going on forever, starting in the Cold War, but it has different concepts to it. So one is the use of science in diplomacy. More and more State Departments are, in fact, trying to use science for diplomatic reasons. Diplomacy for science, that's what I've been talking about. And then science for diplomacy, where countries can talk to each other in ways they never could before. So there's a new group that started that the chief scientific advisors of virtually every country have now been meeting in order to try this globalization of science. The group called INCSA, I'm leaving here and going to Paris for a meeting of the G7, where the National Academies of Sciences are meeting together in order to make this harmonization work, this ability to collaborate work. So it's good. Globalization is happening. It benefits everybody. Subir Suresh, former director of NSF, now the president of NTU in Singapore, has this great line that I love: good science anywhere is good for science everywhere. So globalization is happening, but I wouldn't have gone through all of that if there wasn't a but. And there's a but. So the but is the success of globalization depends on sharing, openness, transparency, and trust. Well, in my country, and in many, we're experiencing a counterforce. That counterforce is sort of scary because it's getting in the way of collaboration, and it's getting in the way of the ability to tackle global issues. And what it is this sort of increased nationalism that we're seeing in various countries. And mine at the moment is really worrying it tremendously. That is, not only are they worrying about the ability to use the science or generate the science, but they're worried about the ownership of the science and who's going to steal it for what other purpose. I did help make that. Do you like that? I really love that. There are these forces going in opposite. Just smile, right? Globalization on the one hand, and nationalism is going in the other direction, and those forces are a big issue. You're seeing it in the US in the form of the visa issues everybody is overly familiar with. Secondly, in the last 6 months, the US Department of Energy has limited the access of foreign scientists to American labs supported by the Department of Energy. I see Americans are nodding because they've watched this happen. NIH, a month ago, had started asking universities about their international contacts and American-funded scientists whether they had international contacts. And I'm involved in a response to the National Science Foundation and the State Department triggering a study of Chinese students and how much access do they have. So that's just, never mind that. What I think we in the scientific community have to be worried about is this counterforce. It sounds paranoid when you start to talk about it. It's like, we all know it's going well. People collaborate around the world. Globalization has momentum. My view, we need to be worried, and we need to start to be concerned about where is that going in the future. I believe countries will be weighing the costs versus the benefits in ways they never have before, and that will have at least some danger that globalization of science, so important to the future of humanity, is going to be inhibited by this national competitiveness and this national fear of security. So with that cheery note, I'll stop. Thank you.
You have a question. I didn't think you don't have a question.
I have a kind of a question back.
I want to ask you another level of question. I mean, I totally agree with what you said about the U.S., and I think the U.S. is suffering from closing down these connections to the outside. Certainly NASA, which has no connections to China, has been suffering enormously from missing out on the Chinese lunar expedition and so on. But I want to ask you a different question. I want to ask you a question about this concept of humanities, science versus humanities versus social sciences, right? Social enterprise. And E.B. Snow, I think it was, who wrote something about the two cultures, I mean, a long time ago. Have you looked into this at all and looked at that other interface, not just the scientists in different parts of the world, but humanities versus science? Because these social issues are coming up enormously, particularly in our country, where we're being held responsible, even blamed for things, where the social sciences are perhaps would be great advocates and helpful companions along the way.
So I'm part of a movement. We don't acknowledge that social sciences might not be sciences. We think they're sciences, actually, so we don't separate them. So there's a big push now, actually most recently led by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, to find ways to integrate science with the humanities. A study was just published within the last 6 months by the National Academy of Sciences, led by David Skorton, the Secretary of the Smithsonian, that in fact looked at integrating it and recommending ways to integrate it into education, because as you heard this morning, what a wonderful couple of examples of integrating the humanities and the sciences than the two talks that we heard that in fact, show us about the history of humankind, that in fact has been elaborated through this collaboration with science. I think that more and more, as scientists get less insecure about their own position in society, they'll recognize the need to work much more closely with people in the humanities. Social sciences in the United States are more and more being accepted as a part of the scientific establishment. The humanities are considered, some humanities disciplines are considered science in Europe. They are not in the United States. They're nowhere near it. So, yes, sir.
I want to ask you about the point you raised concerning failures of research and publishing them. Because if in globalization people don't publish failures, then people duplicate the failures and do not avoid them, and it costs money. And money is becoming a scarce resource. So what's your take on that?
Yes. Basically, I agree with you. That is one of the problems we've had, particularly in things like clinical trials that cost gazillion dollars. If you don't publish a failed clinical trial, somebody else will do the same trial. There's a new thing that NIH, it's not that new anymore, maybe 5 years old, where if you get money for an NIH clinical trial, you in fact have to at least declare whether nothing happened. That is, you can't necessarily get a journal to publish a negative result or a non-result, but you have to declare what it is. And more pharmaceutical companies are talking to each other in secret about, they don't talk about anything in public, together, but they do discuss together what some of those failures are. But your point's a very good one, that not telling the bad news as well as the good news hurts the enterprise.
If I just may add before the next question, the problem of applicability and reproducibility and so on got a very high public note, even in economics and so on, regarding clinical trials, but not only, regarding published experiments. Can we replicate that? Can we reproduce that or not? And it became a very big issue in the last years. And I think that data science became a very big hype as well. And we heard today so many times about AI and so on. The right tools to really do the right experiment, but also to verify the outcome.
So it's taken at least 30 years for the biomedical community to recognize that statistics is for real. And it actually came about because a small group in the American Statistical Association started bugging people, and I can tell you they were bugging Science Magazine about the lousy quality of the statistics we were publishing. And when that started, a group volunteered to start working with our authors, when necessary, to improve the quality of the statistics. It's getting better. It's not there yet.
Just a remark, if I just may, Tel Aviv University has one of the most, maybe the best on the world in data science. He was the one in Nature, Professor Yoav Benjamini, and he was the most quoted one in Nature exactly in this issue. So it's our fame, just, local. Okay.
There was a comment about the desirability, and it's a good idea to have humanities and the social scientists to be considered. It's not just a good idea, it is absolutely essential, especially in the light of your talk this morning and what I was saying. When we are addressing problems of climate change and inequality and affluence and sustainability, it is not just a good idea, they have to be on the table. Because these problems now are interactive. You just can't give, scientists cannot give to society, hey, here is the climate output and you do with it. No, they have to be there and they have to be an integral part of the team to be able to find sustainable solutions for the future.
So, Ellen, I wonder if you would comment on sort of attitudes in society toward science too, which is, I'm thinking, leaders, whatever they can get away with their attitudes about science and all these factors that you're saying that are driving the decisions. Ultimately, it has to be something that the society is comfortable with, and you could have some countries where people are not so sure about scientists, or they think there's fraud, or they think they're saying. They could have other countries, like you gave an example of one that's really investing in their brains and things like that. Maybe you could just give us some thoughts about the society part of it.
So there's a myth in large parts of the scientific community. In fact, we're having a big argument about it before this. I shouldn't tell you this, but I will. So before this G7 meeting, which actually is next week in Paris, that some representatives believe that there's a decline in trust in science. There is no concrete evidence for that. What's changed is that politicians are openly acknowledging that they're not stuck with science. Only we're stuck with science. That is, if I violate scientific facts, I'm useless. I can't do anything, right? Because I'll get caught and then I'm no longer a credible scientist. But the rest of the public won't get struck by lightning. So an unnamed president of a country says, the earth isn't warming, I just don't believe it. And, we all go, oi, converging evidence from, 9 billion studies have shown, hey. He says, yeah, but I don't believe it. It's just not true. He didn't get struck by lightning. If I say it, I would be struck by lightning. And so only scientists and more politicians, policymakers, and other people are feeling that, they're empowered to deny science at will when it's inconvenient or clashes with their values. The only way to counteract that any of us have been able to figure out is for scientists to get out of their ivory towers and engage with the rest of the public. And there's a whole big movement about public engagement with science, but we have learned the hard way that saying what I do is too esoteric, you could never understand it, is like a suicide gesture. The rest of the society said, really? It's that hard? Good. I'm not worrying about it then. And so there's a big movement that I've been a part of that in fact is trying to push scientists to get out in the public. Now, a lot of scientists should not be allowed out in public because of their behaviors. But they can be trained and they can learn it and they can, do it. But that's another speech. I'll spare you.
So I just have a question. Being in sort of the production of some of the science that you get done, I see another force coming in, and that is privacy of our data. Can you comment on whether that is something that you see is going to impact science in the future?
Great question. So it has to do with the privacy of the data that you collect. Change the word, the propriety, the ownership of the data. So I'm also involved in a project called the Center for Open Science that in fact is demanding that journals and other powers like funding sources demand data be shared. If you publish a paper in Science magazine, you must make the data freely available immediately. And that was a policy that was instituted in order to counteract this sort of, I want to own my data and you can't see it and it's proprietary and oops, you might find out there's a boo-boo in it or you might in fact want to borrow it. But I think that within the next 5 years, every funding agency in the world will demand open sharing of data immediately upon publication, and there's no reason not to. There's no counter-argument to that.
There is one. Data can get totally abused if other people use it, and they do very often.
We'll argue that, but I think on a cost-benefit basis, the risk of that happening without it being them getting caught is pretty minimal. But we can argue it later.
If I can, a little clarification of one point and then sort of a comment. One of the things that was mentioned is the non-reproducibility of clinical trials. There's been some recent work, I believe the fellow's name is Goodman, who has shown that because clinical trials are inherently stochastic processes, that is random, that you cannot expect that you're going to be able to repeat a given clinical trial's results because there is a certain randomness in what you get. And unless you adjust your thoughts about how often clinical trials should be repeatable, you're going to be very disappointed. And I think it's important that we understand this. Okay, but that's a very long discussion that we can't go into now. You have advocated for open science, and I am 100% in agreement with it. But the other side of the coin is that there have been poachers on scientific information, and I hate to say it, but the Chinese have been singularly good at it, where they do not respect any proprietary interest in science or technology, and they have stolen other people's work and thoughts, which makes you wonder whether you want to deal with folks like this. And I think if you're going to if you're going to succeed in getting international science, we have to have an understanding that you can't steal other people's thoughts.
Yes. You're absolutely right, and that's the issue that this new study that we're doing is going to try to work on, which is how do you deal with the question that people have different values about intellectual property, and, does it matter if I borrow it? Well, it depends on who you ask. You're absolutely right. Okay, did we do it? I think we did it.
What?
Oh, I meant, are we done?
No,